Good evening. Thanks. Welcome to History Pub. We're so glad you're here. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I work with the Oregon Historical Society, and along with McMenamins, we're your hosts for the evening. The mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. That's a huge charge. We are happy to be the ones to take it on, and we do the work in a lot of ways. Online resources, the Oregon Encyclopedia, our publication, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, our museum exhibits, our educational programs in places like this and in classrooms across the state and to visits to our museum, our research library, which is available to everyone. It's free of charge. There's no appointment necessary. Come in and do your research, but do it soon because after many decades of not having this kind of attention, our research library will be renovated next year in 2020. So, yes, I know. The historians in the room are very excited. We're doing it for you. We really are pleased to have that opportunity, and we're grateful to all of our funders and volunteers who make that work possible. Granting agencies, individuals, corporations, and of course our OHS members and Multnomah County residents, thank you for voting now twice to enact a modest property tax levy to support OHS and 4 historical societies in the East Multnomah County. Please keep in mind, Multnomah County residents, we really appreciate that support. So museum admission is always free for you, and you get discounts on OHS membership, so take advantage of that. Our program tonight is one of a series of programs that we have designed as a celebration and recognition of our opening on Oregon Statehood Day this year of our new core exhibition, Experience Oregon, which seeks to tell broadly and in some places deeply the history of the many, many peoples who have made Oregon the place it is since time immemorial through the 21st century. We really encourage you to come check out the exhibit again and again. And all of the programs that we're doing in this series, including tonight's, which is why this big bright light is on us here, they'll be recorded and available on the OHS website and on our YouTube channel, so you can find those again. Additional programs in the series in October, Katie Barber and Melinda Jetty will be speaking on rethinking Oregon settlement. In November, Kathleen Shea Hill will be giving a talk titled You're So Vain, Indian-White Relations in the 21st Century. And also in November, Mario Cifuentes and Lynn Stephen will be talking, their talk is titled Grounded in This Place, A Deep History of Latino Activism in Oregon. So please put those on your calendar and join us for those as well. It's really such a pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker to History Pub. We've wanted to have her here for a long time. We finally got her all the way up from Southern Oregon. So thanks to Chelsea and everyone else who made her being here possible. Chelsea Rose is a historical archaeologist who focuses on the settlement and development of the American West. She graduated with honors from the University of Oregon and received her graduate degree in Cultural Resources Management from Sonoma State University. Her recent work has included research in the Jacksonville Chinese Quarter, the homestead of frontier photographer Peter Britt, the native Hawaiian mining camp of Kanaka Flat, and the Historic Applegate Trail. Chelsea Rose has been working with state and federal agencies to create a research partnership that focuses on Oregon's Chinese migrant history, and she regularly works with media, students, and community volunteers in an effort to promote archaeological awareness and encourage historical stewardship. Perhaps most importantly, she serves on the Oregon Historical Quarterly Editorial Advisory Board. So please join me in welcoming Chelsea Rose.
Thank you. I'm going to dry out under these lights, so excuse me while I take a sip of water. All right. Thank you all for coming today. I'm excited to be here. This is a great venue. I always love doing these history pubs, and you guys look very comfortable out there, so I'm a little bit jealous. Here we go. I'm going to start out tonight's talk with a little story. As many of you know, this photo is very famous. It marks the Golden Spike celebration, which was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in May of 1869. There's many things striking about this photograph, but recently, in the past few months, it's gotten a lot of circulation again because we just had a big anniversary of this photograph. But also it brings, it kind of is an illustration of one of the themes that we're going to talk about tonight. And that is, most folks know that Chinese railroad workers were instrumental in the construction of this line. And they are not represented adequately in this photograph. So there's various, some people think there are a few Chinese individuals in this photograph. Here it's debated. Other people say they're cropped out, but that's not really the point. The point is Chinese Americans do not feel represented in this photograph that marks this huge moment in American history. 100 years later, at the 1969 Golden Spike celebration, a handful of Chinese Americans headed to Utah from San Francisco, including Phil Choi, who was then president of the Chinese American Historical Society. And he was slated to give a talk to commemorate the Chinese American role in this monumental feat. And unfortunately, he was bumped from the schedule and didn't get to have his say. That lack of representation was really devastating, again, to the Chinese American community. Traveling with Choi was a few other people, including one woman who was the only descendant of Chinese railroad workers to attend that conference, or that celebration. And now we're going to jump forward 50 years to May of this year, which was the 100th anniversary of the Golden Spike. And on that day, 2 Chinese Americans were part of the commemoration ceremony, including Transportation Secretary Ling Chow, who's the first Chinese American to ever hold that role, and Connie Young Yu, who is the daughter of that woman who was the only descendant of a Chinese railroad worker 50 years before. And this part always chokes me up. Wearing the same beautiful silk dress that her mother had specially made for that ceremony. So this was a big deal for this community to be able to be represented and feel heard. Also, having not only 2 Chinese American voices as part of the ceremony, but 2 strong female voices in a narrative that's been traditionally dominated by white men was also a really powerful moment in history when talking about this event. Here's another photograph taken by photographer Corky Lee that's kind of a reimagining of this champagne photo, showing the 500 plus Chinese Americans that attended this celebration, many of whom were descendants of the railroad workers that built this line. And it's on this kind of riding this wave, this enthusiasm that our project was formed. Stanford, in preparation for this moment right here, in 2012, started the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project to bring together scholars from all sorts of disciplines from around the globe to study the topic of Chinese railroad workers and what contributions did they made, what kind of information's out there, what can we learn about these folks so that when this moment comes, we're ready to tell this story as fully as we can. And that project was really great because not only did it get historians and archaeologists and literature studies all talking together, but it also brought together folks from China and the United States to start thinking about this through a transnational lens, which I really think has influenced the scholarship going forward in a very important way. Oops. Forget you saw that. This is a photo that you usually see when talking about, kind of the narrative of American history, this manifest destiny. And I use this slide to illustrate the point that what we're trying to do is to reverse this master narrative. This is one thing that scholars have been talking about since the 80s. And this means basically to kind of to separate out American history from white history, to recognize all the different people that are part of this history and their contributions to the places that we call home, including Oregon. And that's where we come in. The Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. This project was started in 2017, basically, and it started because a lot of different folks doing archaeology realized that we we were kind of focused on these super local studies that were really particularistic and not really finding ways to compare and talk to each other about the types of things we were doing. Archaeology into Chinese American sites has been going on since the 1960s, so a really long time. But a lot of those studies were way out on federal lands, and again, those reports can be hard to find. A lot of those studies, especially in the early days, really focused on this exotic material culture. So you find a lot of these beautiful illustrations of the rice bowls and the dishes, and that's great. It's a really good resource for us to use now, but it's time that we move past that and get really push ourselves to talk about the people and what this kind of material culture can tell us about these individuals that came to Oregon and what their lives were like when they lived here. So that's the goal of this project. We're bringing in as many different stakeholders as we can. You can see a long list of partners on the bottom there, and we want to kind of encourage folks to recognize this as research priority for the state. So far we've been working on a railroad construction site with the Medford District BLM, Bureau of Land Management, down in Southern Oregon. We've been working with the Malheur National Forest up in Grant County. You'll see some photos of that work. We've been working with the Oregon State Parks on the Kamwa Chung and Company site. You'll see some photos of that. And those are some of the agencies we're working with, but we're also partnering, as you heard, with the Oregon Historical Society. They sponsored our lecture series this summer, and a lot of other museums and local historical societies, and we're looking to grow that. And the idea is that the more of us that join together, the wider reach and the more we can work together to uncover this history. Oh, and everybody always asks me later what diaspora means. And the reason why we chose this is because people used to call this discipline overseas Chinese archaeology, and that's still what it's called in China. But Asian American scholars and other scholars pointed out that's kind of problematic because it builds on this rhetoric that Chinese immigrants were always foreign, and they were just perpetually foreigners. They never became Chinese American. So the idea is that's one part of the movement to change it to Chinese diaspora archaeology, but also to recognize this really fascinating, complex web of networks that connected these folks as they immigrated from China all around the world. So here we have Oregon. And just real quickly, I'm going to show you, because this talk I'm not going to get into our sites specifically, I just want to show you so far our footprint on the map. So we first started in Jacksonville, Oregon, that's just west of Medford, down in Jackson County. We've been working, this is with the BLM in the Buck Rock Tunnel. This is in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. This is a railroad site associated with the construction of the Oregon and California Railroad. The BLM was so excited, they asked us to consider Chinese sites on the rest of their districts, so we started looking at, this is the Wolf Creek Tunnel site, a little bit farther to the north in Josephine County. We, like I said, this is the Kamwa Chung and Company. This is in John Day, Oregon, up in Grant County. And then we've got several sites along the middle fork of the John Day River so far, and these are on the Malheur National Forest. But we've got lots of room to grow. So in addition to this, and when you think about, I'm still working on the graphic because I think I can make this a lot more powerful, but this is what I have so far. But when you think about the history of Chinese immigrants in the state, mining is an obvious one. So we have this area basically, then this area up here, up into Idaho. Railroads, of course. You've got the main railroads coming through here. You've got spur lines going all over the place. You have agriculture in the Willamette Valley, hop farmers. The Bing cherry was invented in part by the efforts of a Chinese farmer. We have the cannery workers up and down the coast and along the Columbia River. We have, this is a new discovery this summer that I made, Chinese cowboys in Grant County, Buckaroo Sam and Marquis Tom, he's seen in the top left, that were long established ranchers, buckaroos in this area. I want to know more about that. I bet you guys do too. And then another thing that I've been just recently find out about is Wong potatoes. This is third-generation Chinese American potato farmers in Klamath County, just outside of Klamath Falls, established in the 1930s. That's fascinating. And one of the reasons why, and I'm sure there's more and more, I'm working to fill this in. Of course, there's restaurants, laundries, all these other businesses that also have fascinating story components as well. But one of the reasons why I'm going to talk tonight in particular about rural areas in the state is because, and that's where I really focus my efforts so far, is because that's where I think this story is so important to reintroduce people living in these areas to. For example, when I first heard about Wong potatoes, I was so excited and I started researching it, and I found some information about this amazing family down there, but I also found a lot of people that were just kind of laughing about the name. And that was really upsetting and it's problematic. But I think that really what one of the things that we can address with that is that response is because thanks to this master narrative I'm talking about that we're working on reversing, people don't connect Chinese farmers and ranchers with rural Oregon. It doesn't seem to make sense. So when they see this, they're not recognizing this is a long-established farming family in an area that's really difficult to farm. So I'm hoping that people, through the efforts of this project and a lot of the outreach we're doing and all the different collaborations we have going on, we can start introducing the people back to the history of the places they live and the different people that lived there. This is one of the things we did this summer, one of our big efforts. We had an archaeological field school, and as part of that, we had all sorts of public outreach opportunities, including up here. This was part of a public history hike that was a partnership with the Friends of the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. I made the poor students in my class hike an hour uphill every day to the site, to this mountain, this railroad tunnel. And we got 68 members of the public to do that with us, to come up and see this site, and they just had a great time. So that was really awesome. We had interpretive stops along the way. We had down here, this is a public archaeology day we hosted with Oregon State Parks at the Kamwa Chung and Company site. Not only did we have about 100 or so visitors that day, but we had dozens of visitors, well, probably at least another 100 throughout the week we were working there, coming to learn about archaeology and why we were doing what we were doing there. Up here on the top, this is from our second Passport in Time project with the Malheur National Forest. This is a program that allows citizen scientists to come out and work with archaeologists on these archaeological projects. So this year, I think we had about 20 volunteers. Last year, we had about 10 or 12. So this is another way we're bringing people out, providing opportunities and transparency to what we're doing. Down here we have, this is one of the speakers, Priscilla Wagers, who's a well-known, one of the founders of this field. But this was the lecture series that was sponsored by the Oregon Historical Society. And then one of the other things I have up here is the John Day 1188 Brewing Company in John Day. They were so excited about our project, they made an ale special for us. And this is called the Gamsan Ale, and that means Golden Mountain. And one of the things that was really cool about this, not only was it delicious and archaeologists have a long history of loving beer, but it was so popular, it's on rotation in their brewery, not just the summer when we were there. And that's really great because that's a lasting, kind of reminder in this community of this history. So people come in and there's another talking point to get to know a little bit about the Chinese American community there. So go get some beer there if you're there, it's great. So just very, very quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with kind of this wave of immigration, the vast, vast majority of Chinese immigrants to the United States before the 1960s came from one area, and that's I keep doing that. That's the Guangdong province down here. So China's a really big state, and most folks came from right here. Of that, most folks came from this few county region here. Of that, most folks came to our area from Taishan County, so just one county. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. This is the Pearl River Delta. There's access to Hong Kong and Macau and Canton, which is now Guangzhou. So, and there was a long history of out-migration to make money as an economic strategy to support folks in this region. There were a lot of pressures happening at this time for the folks in this area. There was overpopulation and droughts and famines and the opium wars. So a lot of reasons that people might be pushed towards looking for economic opportunities elsewhere. But one of the things that I always like to point out is that a lot of times when we talk about this history, Chinese immigrants to the United States get portrayed more like desperate refugees than a lot of the other immigrants from other areas, and that's not accurate. For the most part, these folks were not indentured servants or anything like that, especially not to this area. They did come over under credit ticket systems. Some owed money, some were able to raise money, their families, so there was different circumstances, but most folks came over knowing they were taking an economic risk, and a lot of times it actually worked out pretty well for them. So there's a whole range of reasons why folks came to the United States and experiences here that often are overlooked in the historiography of this population. So this is something that's always kind of one of the more difficult aspects to talk about at the end. People always want to know how many Chinese were in Jacksonville, how many Chinese were in this mining camp. And we have census data, so there are numbers. Most people have different numbers for different areas, and I kind of got tired of trying to figure out how to tease an accurate number out of that, because census data is so problematic for this community, especially in the early years, it's almost worthless. I mean, it gives us some sort of number, but there was a lot of disincentive to self-report, depending on the circumstance at the time. When the census takers came through, if this was a mining community, depending on the month they were coming through, folks might be out at the mines, they might be off doing something else, so you didn't always capture the accurate numbers. But most importantly, we don't have good data for this population because of the political climate at the time and a lot of the discrimination and racism that was targeting this population. Basically, since the earliest days in Oregon with the gold rush, and we had the poll tax that targeted Chinese miners. Later on, we had a series of local, state, federal laws targeting this population, culminating in the 1882 Exclusion Law, which was meant to be just for 10 years. It was renewed and expanded every year, and it wasn't repealed until 1943. So I think it's important, rather than to be satisfied with a number, for us to just kind of sit with this uncomfortable uncertainty about how many folks were here, and to recognize that that's a result of part of their experience and part of the reason why they weren't always counted or they weren't always recognized as being in these places and these communities. And where are they now? This is part of the same answer. So all these different communities we're working at in rural areas of the state, none have descendant Chinese communities living in them. And in some areas, like Jackson County, Grant County, a significant number of the early populations, I think in Grant County it might be like 40%. Again, these numbers are not perfect, like I just explained, but it's a significant number, and it's not there now. And that, again, is because of these exclusion laws that at every point there was obstacles from Chinese immigrants coming in to be building the lives like other immigrant populations. A lot of folks that came to Jacksonville came there to look for gold, ended up thinking, this is a pretty cool place to settle. They bought land, they settled down, their descendants are still there. Chinese Americans did not have those opportunities, and so a lot of those folks did not end up in these rural communities. Just to kind of get back to that idea of this as a fairly successful strategy for folks, here, this is China, this is beautiful southern China. Of course, a lot of China is very modern and there's lots of cities, but the rural areas in this part of the world are still pretty, they're not very populated. And there's a lot of this architecture that remains that underscores how important this movement in the 19th and early 20th century of folks moving overseas to North America, to Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, to all over the world to send money home was, the impact it had on these home villages. These structures here are called dialu. They are fortified structures that are in a lot of these villages. I need water again, sorry. these lights are really bright, that are there to protect the residents from bandits. Banditry was always a problem in this area. It got worse in areas where these villages were rumored to be rich. So these really cool structures, sometimes they were family homes, a lot of times they were kind of a communal place where you could go and put your valuables in yourselves if you thought that your village was under threat. One of the interesting things about these is they look pretty old, right? I think these ones date to like the 1920s. Most of them are built late 1880s to the 1920s. They're not that old. And they're a really fascinating mix of Eastern and Western architecture. And that's because not only was money coming home, there was ideas and influences as well. In addition to these fortified structures, money sent home built libraries, hospitals, community centers, and ancestral halls, and those sorts of things, and had a pretty big impact on the built landscape of southern China. Luckily, today, there's a lot of folks working really hard to preserve this landscape. And this area, there's several different villages that are now on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there's tourism starting, and a lot of the folks in these areas recognizing the heritage value of these resources. Here's another village in China. This is Changdong village in Taishan, China. This is the neighboring county. This county is where a lot of folks came to California and Oregon from. This village is actually where I tracked about a dozen or so immigrants to Ashland. They all came from this village here. And I went there and I met with the villagers, and I was able to see the houses that belonged to the folks that came overseas. So there's a really fascinating basically wealth of information that we've just barely started to tap into, and archaeologists now are starting to recognize that in addition to doing our work here in the United States, we need to think about this as well. Because of the context of this particular population, a lot of times the immigrants to places like Oregon were men who had family, wives, parents, all that at home that they were taking care of. And that means the lives they built in Oregon were very much influenced by what was happening across the world. They were active members in two distinct communities. And in order for us to recognize the choices and opportunities and things they took advantage of in Oregon, or things they didn't take advantage of, or things they were willing to put up with in order to make a living, we have to understand the transnational scale of their lives. And that's something that we're really working hard to do now. So now we're going to focus on Oregon and some of the archaeology that we've been doing over the past few years. This is part of the original railroad grade of the Buck Rock Tunnel, so part of that big march uphill. I'm not going to talk too much about that site because we don't have as much data kind of at the point that we do with some of the other sites, so that just gives me opportunity, an excuse to come up again and talk to you about that one. So we're going to start off talking of Jacksonville, Oregon. This is where I first started building this data set. In 2011 to 2013, we were excavating there. Historians have called this the earliest Chinese community in the Pacific Northwest. It predates Portland. And it never was very big, but it was pretty early. As part of an Oregon Department of Transportation infrastructure project, they were redoing some sidewalks. We knew we were going through the Chinese community, and we ended up excavating part of this house right here, this building here, which you can see in this picture here. Jacksonville itself, most of the town, is a national landmark. It's one of the first on the West Coast. So a lot of times people think it's this frozen in amber Western community, but what they don't realize is the modern landscape is political. Things that were preserved and reconstructed, it's political, those choices. And there's really important parts of that historical community that are not represented today. And one of those is the very bustling Chinese Quarter that was located just in this area here. So we've been working hard to kind of bring those stories back to light. This project, people always ask, what's the coolest site you've ever excavated? This one, hands down. We knew we were going through the Chinese community. We knew we were going to find some cool stuff. We had no idea we were going to basically come down on a house that was burned. The fire started at 3 a.m. Tuesday morning, September 11th of 1888. And basically this house, because of the fire and the people got out, nobody got hurt, but it was left as a time capsule of that night when the residents went to sleep. And when we say it's perfectly preserved, that's archaeology speak, because this is what it looks like. Most people would be like, huh? But one of the things that we were interested in is we used fire science. We worked with the fire department to kind of rebuild the inside of the house. Basically, we had tons of artifacts. Some were melted, some weren't, and we were able to use fire science to figure out the things that weren't burnt. That was because something protected them, and that something was furniture. So we were able to get a lot of great information about the house. In addition, this site was so incredibly preserved. We've got floorboards here. We've got flagstone for a kitchen. We had a wok oven over here. This is the pantry. I've talked a lot about the site, and I've got so much information about that. I don't want to get sidetracked because it's such a cool site. But basically, we found so much data, really, really rare, incredible time capsule of a Chinese individual or individuals in the height of the Exclusion Era in a small community like Jacksonville. You know, we don't have a lot of documents from this population in this area, so this was really, really helpful to figure out about their lives. This was an artist illustration. The city of Jacksonville did some interpretive panels there, and so when I was just trying to explain, I was basically downloading data to them about all the cool stuff, and they were like, wait, we need someone to draw this because we don't know what you're talking about. So basically this was, I told an artist kind of some of the things we found and what we were thinking, and they made a visual representation of what the house could have looked like. And this kind of got us on this theme. When we started building this bigger collaborative partnership, we had a choice. What do we want to study? What do we want to prioritize? And so I've been really interested in this idea of home, not just a structure or a building, not just nails and wood and the things that you have to do to survive, like you have to eat, you have to have shelter, but I'm interested in this idea of home. What does it mean to make a place home? And I think, to me, that gets at some of the other things that populate a house, which is, you know, bulbs, flower bulbs, pictures, and gaming things, some of the things that represent the way you spend time, the way you socialize, and the things that you have to remind you of home, or the things you think are cool. You know, that's what I'm interested. So when we started working on this project, we were targeting Chinese homes across mining sites, railroad sites, whatever we could do. So I'm going to show you some of the homes we've found so far. So these are all still early stages, and some of them won't have the amount of data that we got from Jacksonville, and some of them we won't be able to excavate as completely, but we are getting a lot of information. That we're building a really big data set. So this is one Hearth feature. This is associated with a Chinese mining site in the Malheur National Forest. This one dates to the 1860s, I believe, and it's associated with a large complex that has lots of artifacts scattered around the surface, and we were recording those and trying to understand a little bit about this rock pile. Here's another one. This is one of several cabins on the mining, or the Happy Camp mining district in the Blue Mountains along the Middle Fork of the John Day River. Again, this doesn't look like much, but this is a hearth, and we spent, some of the people in the audience tonight spent a lot of time excavating down, and this is basically what we found. We found a lot of information in that about how it was constructed. There was charcoal artifacts, faunal material, so animal bones that can give us some clues about what were being consumed at the site. We did send material from this hearth to a botanical specialist in the hopes we could find seeds or plant remains, and we weren't lucky here, unfortunately. But we're getting some really good information from this site about what it was like for the Chinese miners living here at this house, and how that compares to Jacksonville, how it compares to the other sites in the forest as well. Here's another one. This is one from this summer. This is the Ahang 2 site. Again, we have another rock pile here. That's the remnants of a hearth that would have been attached to a structure. Some of them have wood, or they're dug out into the ground a little bit, so we can recognize that archaeologically, but it's hard to see in the photographs. And then we also found homes and houses that didn't have rock features associated with them, so they were a little bit harder to see, but we found wood, parts of the structure itself, in them. Here's one from Aheng 1, and it was associated with a whole bunch of artifacts and stuff that we can start to populate. What did that household have in it, and how does that compare? Archaeologists are not only interested in artifacts, which are great, and they can have a lot of diagnostic information, but when we find features, which is basically an artifact that's not portable, so part of a sill plate or a board from a house that's fallen in place and it's been there. This has been there since this building collapsed. And so we know that stuff found under it or around it is associated with this specific building and hasn't been dropped there by later loggers or moved around, so this is really important information when I show you all these features, and we're really lucky that we have so many different features associated with these archaeological sites so that we can start to really add a lot of nuance to the story. Here's another one here. This is at the Kam Wah Chung State Heritage Site. This is the Singh House. We got the name from a memory map from someone. We found 2 houses, remnants of houses, from the John Day Chinatown, and I'm really excited about that because there was a big Chinese community around the Kam Wah Chung and Company Museum, which is still survives today. That's an incredible museum. If you haven't been, at least watch the Oregon Public Broadcasting video about it, or go there. It's amazing. But the danger in thinking about that site in a vacuum is that it seems like an anomaly, and it's not. And the anomaly is that it survived. That building was made of stone, and I don't even think I have a picture of it in this presentation, unfortunately. So it survived, the contents survived, that was a fluke, but it was one of several Chinese merchant businesses in the John Day Chinatown, let alone one of many, many, many in the state. So it's important that we understand the community that was around it that helped create the thriving business that could survive into the 20th century. And so that's what we're trying to do by looking into the John Day Chinatown. This summer we found evidence, like I said, linking 2 other households, and so that allows us, again, to not only add these houses to this comparison we're building across the site, or the state, but we have 3 households in the John Day Chinatown that we can also compare, and that can let us start seeing the community, what was the community like, and also how different was this house to the Kam Wah Chung Museum house. So there's a lot of really exciting information that we're going to be able to tease out of these discoveries on the ground. And then we have another one. This is another one from the Happy Camp Mining District. There's no stones attached to it. One of the cool things about this one is this site, this household dates to the maybe 1910s into the 20th century. One of the other themes that's exciting, the Malheur National Forest has been doing a lot of research into this, the mining across this area, and what they're realizing is that there was more Chinese miners, and they were mining there longer than previously thought. So what we're seeing now is these remote mining camps as a strategy for navigating the exclusion era. If it wasn't maybe very easy to get by in town, where there was maybe more negative attention from the white community, maybe you could make a good living out in the country or in the the remote wilderness mining, and you had other community out there, and that was another economic strategy for continuing this this particular resource extraction, I guess you could say. In addition, a lot of folks made their way to Portland, of course, at this time period. Now I'm just going to show you the inside of a couple houses from China. These are from Taishan, and these houses are empty. They haven't been occupied for a long time, but there's some information in there that we can use to try to extrapolate how similar is the layout here to the layout that we're seeing in Oregon. What kind of artifacts are we seeing that are the same? We're not excavating these, but we did kind of go through and document some of the stuff from them. So, there's a lot of potential for, again, that transnational comparison. One of the other things we've been doing was looking at vernacular architecture. This is not a house, this is an outbuilding, but this has this rammed earth technology, which was really common in southern China for building buildings. And we've seen that there's definitely some buildings, some stores in California that had rammed earth techniques. The place we excavated in Jacksonville, I think that there was kind of an extension on it built using rammed earth. We didn't realize it at the time, but now that makes a lot of sense what we are seeing. And we excavated part of a mining reservoir. So in addition to these mining camps and houses out there, there's huge mining landscapes of ditches and ponds and all the different ways these miners were controlling water to extend the mining season. And so we excavated one of those, and we saw, again, it was constructed using the same vernacular architectural style. So that's another instance of ideas coming over along with people and traditions and skills that we can see archaeologically. Some of the other themes in addition to home that I'm starting to look at, it's really exciting because now I think we have data from 9 different archaeological sites that we've worked on, and we're building more to this data set, and we've barely just tapped into it. There's so much more to do. But so now when I have kind of an idea, it's like, I wonder if we could look into this. It's amazing how much just we have this data for, which is really exciting. And I hope that not only will this answer some of the things I'm interested in, but this information will be available to scholars and other folks that have interesting research questions that we can explore. So one of the things I'm starting to look into is this idea of safety and security. So how, we know without a doubt that there was structural racism, the Chinese faced that. We know that there was lots of different examples of acute racism, the driving out, some of the attacks and different instances like that. But we don't know much about day-to-day basis how much interpersonal violence was there for Chinese individuals in these communities. And I'm curious about that, and I'm wondering if the archaeological record can kind of help us get at some of those questions. We find locks and keys and all sorts of stuff in these sites, but what I'm starting to think is that that doesn't always reflect an acute threat. Sometimes there's other reasons why these places would have been secure. One of the other things we're looking into is what kind of access to weaponry did Chinese miners and railroad workers and whoever have. One of the things that's really interesting so far is a lot of the artifacts associated with weaponry that we're finding is really dated. So for example, on one of these mining camps that dates to the mid to late 19th century, we have a black powder double trigger rifle. That's a gun that belongs decades earlier. So, and that's similar to what the Changdong village project also found in China, excavating near in one of the villages that had one of those border towers. They were finding flint from flintlock rifles. I mean, again, this is really old weaponry, and what's it doing in a 20th century site? So this gets at questions of access, opportunities, preference. I mean, we don't really know. So that's something that I'm starting to look at to see what does that mean and what can we learn about it. This isn't the kind of stuff that's getting written down or documented, so it's important that we have these archaeological data that can tell us what's going on. Another fun thing is we found at the Wolf Creek Tunnel site, this is one of the railroad camps, this is a rifle barrel turned into a crowbar. So it's been modified, but it also kind of says to me that this was something that was in use because this is a temporary camp. They're moving along. So it's not like they have tons of stuff stored for years and years. This is something that maybe they were using and it broke, or they decided to get rid of it and they turned it into another useful tool. So that's another clue to the types of weaponry that was around within this community in Oregon. This also is a segue to one of my other themes that's really interesting, which is the way that artifacts were repurposed, reused, reimagined. We see this a lot across Chinese mining sites in Oregon. We see this is a part of a 5-part gold pan that's probably just broken, but a lot of the sheet metal from cans, from big tins or big barrels and big like kerosene lanterns, all those kind of things, is being repurposed and reused. This is some sheet metal that's being purposed into a grizzly, which is part of a mining technology used by placer miners. And let's see what we got here. Okay, there we go. Yeah, and we have some other cans being used. This is a lantern. We have a lot of modified shovels. I'm going to talk more about that. And then these mystery things. This could have been used for, I guess like a sprinkler for anything, a shower head kind of a deal. So we don't know, but we find lots of those kind of artifacts as well. And this is a theme that we're really interested in because what is this reference? Access? I mean, a lot of these sites are really far. It's not easy to get to. There's no hardware store down the road. So, of course, you can't always get a new shovel. You have to work with what you have, or sheet metal. Perhaps it's just there aren't the tools available locally anyway that you might want. So there's one scholar that has argued that they're repurposing the spade shovels into this other kind of tool that was common in China that wasn't available in the United States. So that's another option. And then also maybe it's just a second life. After the shovel breaks, you still could use part of that tool for something. We see repurposing and modification in other types of artifacts as well. Opium cans, they're kind of like this, I think it's brass alloy, and they're pretty sturdy metal. This is one with part of the label on it. We see them repurposed for lots of other things as well. At Jacksonville, we found one that contained bone dust. That is a traditional Chinese medicine. That was very exciting to see. We found lots of them cut into gaming tokens. They've also been cut into opium pipe repair pieces, different decorative things, I'm not sure. This was one that came out of one of our mining sites, this opium can turned lamp. This is bent metal. There's like a wick, a cotton wick inside. That was very exciting to find. So lots of different ways that these things are being repurposed. This also is an important reminder too, because a lot of times one of the stereotypes that I'm almost always afraid to even mention the O word when I talk about this because it tends to hijack the rest of the story. Everything gets eclipsed by opium because it's so powerful as a signifier of a lot of this rhetoric that we're trying to get away from. But this is a reminder that there's a lot of different reasons why those artifact types were useful. And not every time you find opium cans does it mean that they were associated with actual opium smoking. They could be associated with a lot of other things as well. There was a lot of opium smoking happening too, though. This is one of the really exciting things from this summer. This picture is actually from last summer. We had one of the Passport in Time projects. The folks went out and metal detected and identified all these pink flags are metal detector hits. And through that work, they discovered what we were calling the shovel graveyard, just tons of shovels you can see in this pile here. And that was really mysterious and intriguing to us because we were like, oh, what if this is the blacksmith shop? We're finding these things isolated here and there across the forest, and here's a pile of them. Maybe this is where they're being cached. This is where the reuse happens. Let's look into it. So we did. This summer, the field school worked on the Blacksmith Shop site. My idea was, because we couldn't dig up the whole thing, we'd scrape a big area to kind of see under the surface. A lot of stuff's pretty shallow here, so we took off the duff and scraped down just a little bit so we could see artifacts across the surface. And what was this? Is this really a blacksmith shop? Is it just a weird shovel pile? And we did find more evidence that there was something happening there. This here is the excavation that was within kind of one of the concentrations by the shovels, and we found, I would say, conclusively there was blacksmithing happening here. So that was really exciting so far, and let me know if you know otherwise, but I've asked as many people as I can think of. This is the first archaeological excavation of a Chinese blacksmith shop in the state. There's one in Idaho that has a really great master's thesis written on it that we've been doing a lot of research into, but this is the first one I know of in Oregon, and we've got a lot of great information that we've got a lot of work to do to try to figure out what's going on. I was talking about earlier features, so we're finding stuff that tells us we're in the right spot, the stuff hasn't been moved around. In addition to rocks with melted metal on them, which is pretty amazing. We found that a lot of evidence that the ground had been really, really under extreme heat. There's wood in there that was really fired. So we're trying to figure out what exactly this means because there's a lot of different ways that blacksmithing can happen, and there's a lot of different types of footprints on the ground that are I guess resulting from it. One person said perhaps there were actually smelting here. There was different smelting techniques to repair cast iron walks and different things like that. So we've got a lot of work to figure out what we're looking at. Here is some of the field school students that spent many days digging in the blacksmith shop And one of the girls in this photo is here tonight. There's a lot of students in the audience, so at the end maybe you can ask them questions if you have some questions more about this project. Here is the big open expanse of this feature. So this is before that hole was dug in it, but I wanted to go back. So here's the shovels, and we took points and collected artifacts from across this huge area to try to see from a plan view of what kind of stuff's happening here. And now we're able to go back to the reference books and all this and figure out, how this blacksmith shop could have been laid out. So there's apparently, if you find more slag and this kind of stuff in one area, that's the waste pile or the fuel pile. They were burning charcoal, not coal for this, processed coal. So they could have been making charcoal them to use as well. So there's a lot of really cool stuff we're looking at. This is just from one bag of one level. There was multiple bags out of this that came from here. So lots of slag and clinker. This is a pick tip that's either been modified or perhaps it was being used as a tool. We've got different types of metal modification. So I think that there's going to be a lot of really great evidence in here of Chinese blacksmithing. There's reasons why this is so exciting, because so far we found the miners and we see the impact of the miners on the landscape, but we don't always see the suite, like the team that came along with the miners. There was a whole suite of occupations that were important. And blacksmithing, you couldn't do too much back then, no matter what you were doing, without a blacksmith, because you had to fix the horses, you had to fix the metal tools and all that. So now we have that occupation marked on the landscape, which is really cool. In addition to digging in the dirt, I'm starting to kind of wrap up here a little bit. We're digging in the archives. This is at the Kam Wah Chung State Heritage site. They have huge archives, tons and tons of documents written in Chinese, barely scratched the surface. They haven't been translated, and there's a lot of really exciting work to happen still that we're trying to look into. So when we're talking about relationships between rural areas and cities and remote mining camps, it's in these documents. We've got letters, we've got orders, people ordering stuff from San Francisco, from Portland to send out to the Kam Wah Chung. We've got people sending letters there. We've got hotel slips, opium purchases, all sorts of stuff in there. So I've got a lot of hope for the kinds of documents that are come out of that, because this is written by the Chinese community, for the Chinese community, within the Chinese community. This is certainly a voice in this story that has not been engaged to the extent that it should be. So this is really exciting. We also have in Grant County and other places some of these ledgers that tell us what Chinese miners were purchasing from Chinese store owners or white store owners. So that, again, can help us see what kind of stuff's going through, what kind of stuff's being imported, and how these interactions are. We also can see who's paying who to do laundry. So there's a lot of these relationships that are captured in the pages of these kind of documents that we can start to look at as well. We have a lot of work to kind of, I guess, quantify and qualify all this data that we're bringing in. We have a lot of mapping and cleaning and sorting of artifacts still to happen. I thought I would have more done by the time I got this talk, but we have thousands of things in the lab that I haven't got a chance to look at since this summer. So there's more and more to be discovered, and I'm really encouraged by how much information we have to kind of keep adding to the story, keep exploring these different avenues. So what's next? So here's the Kam Wah Chung building. I did have one in here. The Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, we are still growing. We're still bringing in partners. We are looking to do more work in China, to do more research over there, more collaboration with colleagues over there. We're working to work with our tribal partners as well to look at the interactions between Native Americans and Chinese immigrants. We're looking for any other type of Chinese site in the state that would be worth noting and documenting, and we're always looking for more partners as well. And anybody that wants to kind of jump in the research, we've got different things you can do, both digging in the dirt and helping from afar as well. And just to reiterate, the purpose of this and the importance of this is we want to tell these stories. There's so many amazing stories about Oregonians and what it means to be an Oregonian and what the Oregon experience was across the 19th and 20th century. And in rural areas in particular, a lot of that early diversity has been lost for various reasons. So if we can start to bring those stories back, it's not just, you know, an exercise in being PC. It's an exercise in being accurate and telling the best story of Oregon that we can, the most accurate story we can. And I think that there's a lot of lessons to learn in this story that will be important to consider in modern times as well. Just before I close, if you want to find out more about the project in China that was led by Stanford, the Changdong Village Project, this is the first archaeological project into these Chinese home villages. I was there as well. You'll see my face. But here's a documentary they made that was just released this year. And it's got a lot of really great, interesting information about this transnational work. And there's more building off of that as well. And then there's a lot of people to thank. Right down there on the bottom is my email if anybody wants to get in touch. I also have cards and other literature I can hand out as well. And then I have to plug, coming this winter is a book on Chinese diaspora archaeology in North America. That's an edited volume with lots of really great chapters talking about the latest research and some of the things that we're thinking about in the discipline, some of the directions that we're hoping to go next. So keep your eye out for this as well. And then I guess it's time for them to reshuffle and we'll ask questions. But thank you all for sitting in those comfy chairs and putting up with me.
Hello, thank you for all that information, and I might be revealing my ignorance here, but when you talk about the exclusion era, I guess I think of exclusion from immigration from China, but it sounds like you were talking about more than that, like experiences within communities within Oregon. Could you explain more?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 1882 Exclusion Act did target immigration from China of folks to be laborers in the United States. Merchants were still allowed. They could bring their families over. If you were already a laborer living in the United States, you couldn't bring your family over. You couldn't really go home. Or if you did go back to China, you might not be able to get back in the United States. As it was strengthened, there was residency requirements. You had to have ID and papers on you, or you could be deported. But another thing that it did was it really served to justify violence and aggression towards the Chinese population. A lot of the discrimination was kind of justified, again, that people felt by this legislation that this population was not wanted. It impacted the types of jobs they could get. One of the results was that the Chinese labor population did kind of age out, which made room for Japanese railroad workers and Sikh railroad workers that came in the 20th century. But it also, I mean, the big impact was that folks couldn't bring over their families, they couldn't go back and visit their families, and there was a lot of fear and insecurity about their status in the United States and how they belonged in these communities. And that was just one of many different laws. There was local laws. There was, for example, a soap tax that seemed kind of innocuous, but it was targeting Chinese laundries. There was, all different types of laws that would target this population. And that was kind of accumulating into the exclusion era and the anti-Chinese kind of movement at that time period. Any other questions? Is everybody scared to go to the microphone?
My question is, again, about the immigration. And I realize it's hard to generalize, and I know that the law didn't allow, it was primarily males that immigrated, and they were not allowed to bring their families. Do we know, was it their intention to return to China at some point and retire, if you will, or was that not feasible, or was their hope to try to move to this country? And I realize different people do different things, but do we have information on that?
Yeah, and exactly, the answer is exactly that. Different people had different goals and motivations. So some people certainly did hope to come over, get rich, go back, and live the good life. Not just folks coming from China. People from all over had that goal. And then other folks that came over, they came over to build businesses. A lot of the merchants came over knowing they wanted to establish a business here and live here permanently. And some other folks maybe, thought one thing when they first got here, liked it, wanted to stay, liked the opportunity. So there was a whole range of experiences and motivation, and it's really hard to pinpoint, to generalize it. But one of the things that is important, again, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that the opportunities were not the same for this population. So even though folks immigrating from other places in Europe for the gold rush, they thought, I'm going to just go home and be rich. But they came here, they fell in love with the scenery, they liked the communities, they had opportunities to put down roots and build lives. And the Chinese Americans that were here, and I say Chinese Americans because, for example, in Jacksonville, by the 1880s when this house burned down, that Chinese community had been around for 30 years. A lot of those folks were there for decades, longer than a lot of their white neighbors. And so, what was their motivation? After living in a community for 30 years, I think that they probably had different thoughts about it than they did when they first moved there. So there's a whole, the whole range of experiences and motivations. Yeah.
Chelsea, thank you for your presentation. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Chinese underground in Pendleton, Oregon. Also, as I visit cemeteries in Eastern Oregon, I'm haunted to see tombstones in these pioneer cemeteries with Chinese markings on them in kind of a Chinese enclave of Eastern Oregon cemeteries.
Yeah, so those are two really good questions. So I'm going to answer the second one first. So the tombstones, there are Chinese graves across the state. There were a lot of other Chinese immigrants that died, and their bodies were repatriated back to China as part of a tradition. And a lot of folks, when they came to the United States, they would set up kind of an insurance policy sort of a thing, so that if they died, somebody would make sure that their remains made it back to their village. So there was a lot of folks that had graves temporarily that were excavated and sent back home, and that was a very confusing thing for a lot of the white members of the community to witness, but it was something that was certainly part of the Chinese tradition of reverence of the ancestors and being able to have access to your ancestors so that you can honor them appropriately. So that's the second question. To get back to the first question, you're not going to like the answer. In this book that's coming out in 2020, Dr. Priscilla Wagers, who I mentioned, she's been working on this subject for a very long time. She has the Asian American Comparative Collection, and she's a scholar that's written extensively about Chinese, Japanese Americans in the West. And she took it upon herself to do some research into basically what is an urban myth of Chinese living underground in tunnels, or Chinese tunnels in general. Every community, it seems like, has some sort of story about that. In Jacksonville, there's Chinese tunnels, everybody tells me. And I know for a fact they're Depression-era mining tunnels, so they're from the 30s. They're long after the Chinese. And in Pendleton, like in Seattle, like in Portland, like in Salem, the tunnels are actually sidewalk vaults, and there's actually no evidence that Chinese people ever lived underground. So these stories are pervasive, though. There's a lot of people that really feel that they're true, but this historian and archaeologist has not been able to uncover any evidence that actually supports those stories. In fact, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. And that's something that people don't always like to hear, but I think it's important to kind of debunk that myth, and not because the people that run those tours in Pendleton mean any disrespect, but it still is a problematic myth. And I think a lot of times what it's referencing is that Chinese were driven underground in some ways during the Exclusion Era, but not literally. It's more like the Underground Railroad. People weren't actually underground. It's not a literal thing. So so there's a lot of evidence that debunks that myth. And in fact, I haven't been to that tour lately, but a lot of people asked me about that. And Priscilla Wagers went through there this summer and said that a lot of the artifacts are Japanese. They're not even Chinese. So I would say read the chapter in the book, and that's one of the reasons we were really pleased to have it in there, because there is every city seems to have the myth. The Shanghai tunnels in Portland is another example of that as well. Yes?
Yes, you've mentioned Chinese in very rural areas out, beyond the normal areas. And I'm wondering if there were any sites in the Willamette Valley, and also what you can tell us about Chinese in Astoria.
Yes, so there was lots of sites in the Willamette Valley, and one of the reasons I haven't focused on the Willamette Valley is because there's a large descendant community that still lives in the Willamette Valley. The Portland Chinatown Museum, we're very lucky that this is open in the last year or so. They've been really active working with the community here in Portland. We're working with them too to try to expand some of their reach as well outside of Portland, but there's a lot of descendant communities in Portland from the merchant families and the various Chinatowns that were here. In Astoria, there is quite a lot of cannery history there. There was a large Chinese community as well. I think there still is a lot of folks that are descendants of that community. I haven't worked in that area specifically yet, but we really hope to branch out into the coast and up along the Columbia to look at the cannery sites as well. I think that that's a really a rich area to get those stories as well. In fact, I've been talking to some folks about some different Chinese restaurants in Seaside and some other places as well. There's a lot of great history up there that I hope we can loop into our project as well. Yeah.
One final question. Are you willing to come up early next year to speak to another group?
Possibly. Talk to me after. Thank you. If my calendar allows. Any other questions?
What is the rammed earth?
Okay, he asked what the rammed earth technology was. So that is, China's not the only place that used that kind of construction technique, so it's kind of like Adobe. So you can see that in China, and one of the things that's really cool is anytime you're making brick or any sort of clay kind of thing like that, you need a temper. So sometimes people use shell or stones. Sometimes in southern China, they use ancient pottery, so that's pretty interesting. You can see really old pieces of pottery in there as like temper to hold this clay structures together. It was used in California. There's a couple of stores that were built, so it would look similar to Adobe. Like I said, we found retaining walls and reservoirs that were used. They used that technique, so you just pound it in. And in Jacksonville, we found in this area that was the kitchen, kind of off that side of that image I showed you, we found all this really, really hard clay, and we thought we were out of the structure, and then we found artifacts underneath, and we were like, what? And then I realized later that that was part of the building that they added on and used this really low-tech, construction style. There's lots of clay in Jacksonville. There's lots of clay in a lot of places in Oregon that you can get, and you can just make this building style. I guess that, I can't remember what it's called. It has there's a Chinese name that starts with a K, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Dennis? Yes. Okay. Yeah. And I think there's a lot more work to recognize it in the United States because there's probably a lot more instances of it that just haven't been recognized. Yeah.
So your work I find very fascinating, very valuable. How can we support this work?
Oh, great question. Well, there are some flyers in the back about the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology. If you want to volunteer, get involved, let me know. One of the goals of this work is to not only to be as transparent as possible during the fun part, which is in the field. That's the easy part to get people out to go look at the dig, but throughout all the other phases as well, which is a lot harder to kind of maintain that transparency. So we are looking for partners, and one of the things that we're hoping to do is build some opportunities with the Portland Chinatown Museum for folks living up here. There's different things that maybe you can do to help our project based out of Portland. We've got, if you can read Chinese, boy, do we have some translation work for you if you're interested. There's a lot of other ways that you can get involved. From afar, we'll have another Passport in Time project this summer. There's different ways you could donate if you want to sponsor a student to be involved in this research. So basically, there's There's lots of different ways you can get involved and support the work. Also, if you know other sites that would be important for us to consider or look out, or other community groups or individuals we should be talking to or working with, we're still building this partnership, and we're interested in having as many stakeholders as possible. And not to mention, I'm really interested to hear what other kind of research questions people have. You know, I know what stuff we're interested in, and some of my colleagues that we've been working on, but what is the Chinese American community, or Chinese Oregonian community want to know? How can we make sure we're addressing those interests as well as some of the archaeological ones that we've got? So please get in touch if you want to hear more or if you want to get involved. So, and if you want to go dig in the dirt with us, please come with us.
I'm sure Chelsea will stick around and
Yes.
answer questions for a few more minutes. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much, Chelsea.